we have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order. Multipolarity Dialogues is a series of interviews that scan the geopolitical horizon. We talk to some of the sharpest analysts, thinkers, and experts about how they see the world beyond the visible edge of the geopolitical now. The Middle East is as violent and fractious as ever, but now the questions that arise from that violence appear more important than ever. Israel seems to want to end the chaos in a way that provides it with military dominance over the region and some semblance of peace. But can it achieve this, or even survive for much longer, given the scale of enmity it faces in the region and the recent shifts in US domestic politics? What of Egypt, which has been, since the Second World War, the dominant military power within the region? And are we seeing the reemergence of Turkey to its traditional place as regional hegemon? Well, to answer these questions tonight, we have Firas Modad. Firas is a Druze Lebanese convert to Catholicism who now lives and works in the UK as founder and principal of Modad Geopolitics, a consultancy which provides commercially relevant analysis of the effect of geopolitical change on specific regions and industry sectors. Firas, for some years now, has been a mainstay geopolitical commentator on the podcast circuit, and indeed hosts his own podcast, Realpolitik, within the burgeoning Lotus Eaters ecosystem. Firas, welcome.
Yeah, really great to be here. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, good stuff. Look, Firas, about 2.5 years ago, Philip and I on Multipolarity were talking about something that was getting hardly any coverage in the mainstream financial or legacy media, which was something of a détente and stabilization within the Middle East. Saudi Arabia has re-established diplomatic relations with Iran. They had each reopened their consulates in Tehran and Riyadh, and had even gone so far as to conduct joint naval patrols in the Persian Gulf. You also had something like a kind of an ending, so to speak, of the Syrian civil war, where it appeared that Assad had emerged somewhat victorious, bruised and battered, but had survived, and he was being readmitted to the Arab fold. He was invited back to the League of Arab Nations. And Saudi Arabia itself was also moving toward signing the Abraham Accords with Israel. How far that would have actually gone, we will never know, but certainly there were negotiations to that end. Then, of course, we had the October 7th atrocities and Israel's reaction to those atrocities, which have really thrown the entire region back into the sort of tumult in which it's found itself since 2003, essentially. And I wonder what your assessment. You are a global geopolitical analysis, but I think it's perhaps fair to say that you absolutely specialize in the Middle East and North Africa. And I wonder if you could provide an overview of where things now stand in the Middle East after that sudden, I hesitate to call it a black swan event, because one really ought to, at least price in some chance of, an outrageous orgy of violence between the Palestinians and Israelis, which is sickening on both sides to any right-minded person.
Yes.
And so perhaps it wasn't a black swan, but certainly it threw over the table and completely, knocked over all of the pieces in the Middle East, which appeared to be organizing themselves in the run-up to that.
Yes. So we had been saying before October 7 that the resistance axis, the sort of coalition led by Iran, including Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthi, the Iraqi militias, was preparing for a major war and was building up the capabilities for a major war. But it seemed that Hamas really jumped the gun and initiated the conflict before everybody was actually ready. And they initiated October 7 with the aim of bringing everybody else in the Axis into the fight. This was the objective. They wanted to force all of their allies to fight alongside them in what they had hoped would be one decisive conflict that would stop the Israelis from expanding further in the West Bank, that would stop the Israelis from trying to change the status quo at the Temple Mount Aqsa Mosque complex, that would bring the whole Middle East behind them. To some extent, despite the utter destruction of Gaza, they were successful, but perhaps not in the way that anybody had expected or that they had expected. Because one result of this war was Hezbollah's defeat. They signed a ceasefire agreement that was indistinguishable from surrender, I would argue, that they've since refused to implement because it required them to disarm, and they are not disarming. Syria was knocked out of the game, and Turkey came out victorious, and now there is talk of sending Turkish troops to Gaza, which is an absolute nightmare for the Israelis, because the original Iranian strategy was to try to surround Israel with a ring of fire from Yemen through Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Gaza. And now it's the Turks who are in control of Syria. And if things become unstable in Lebanon, you can see the Sunni powers in Lebanon deciding to finally put the Hezbollah question to an end. And if Turkish forces are deployed in Gaza, or any kind of Muslim forces are deployed in Gaza to implement the Trump agreement, this would be a nightmare for the Israelis. So what ended up happening was, in a way, the worst possible outcome for Israel, because Hamas succeeded in rallying the Sunni world to their side to a large extent, and was able to switch positions from being backed by Shia Iran to being backed by Sunni Turkey. And this is quite dangerous for the Israelis, because the most vulnerable country next is Jordan, where the king is not popular and the monarchy isn't able to achieve very much beyond maintaining stability, where the Muslim Brotherhood is the single largest organized opposition group, and where the younger generation of the Muslim Brotherhood wants to change the regime in Jordan and bring about a more radical alternative that is willing to fight Israel. Jordan, having the longest border with Israel, is really a keystone state of the Middle East. The reason that Jordan exists is to secure Israel's longest border, is to secure Israel's flank. So with the changes that we're seeing now, it's very much the rise of Turkey. And if you sort of look back, Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood was founded after the decision by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk to dissolve the caliphate, and therefore for the first time to end the religious state that included and protected all Muslims, with the aim of bringing that state back, with the aim of bringing back a caliphate, any kind of caliphate, religious rule. And you see Erdogan working his way towards it. He's not been as revolutionary as Khomeini, being able to impose a theocracy, but you see him committed to this kind of ideology, and committed to the ideology of rule in accordance with Islamic values. And now, helped by the actions of Hamas, Iran, and Israel, he ended up taking control of Syria. Whoever controls Syria can control Lebanon, and putting Jordan very much in the crosshairs. Plus, the actions of Israel, especially the attack on Qatar, have backfired spectacularly, because it terrified the Egyptians enough to think that, okay, the Israelis are serious and might one day decide that they're going to blow open the border between Gaza and Sinai and force the Palestinians out of Gaza and into Egypt, which would be so destabilizing to Egypt that it might threaten the Egyptian regime and force them into war with Israel. So the Egyptians then turned to Turkey and said, let's do joint naval exercises in order to signal to the Israelis that if they were to escalate any further, we will together work against them. So that's sort of Egypt trying to work together with Turkey, even though after the 2013 overthrow of the Muslim Brotherhood president of Egypt by the current ruler of Egypt, General Sisi, relations between the two sides had deteriorated massively. But the Gaza war brought Turkey and Egypt closer together again. So the summary of all of this is as follows. The Islamic Revolution in Iran was defeated as a result of 7 October. We saw the strikes on Iran. It was able to retaliate and do some serious damage to the Israelis, but proportionately not as much. The whole Western world rallied to defend Israel. So when the Iranians were striking Israel, you saw French, British, American, and Jordanian jets collaborating to shoot down Iranian drones. And it was Turkey that emerged on top, meaning that the strongest Sunni country in the region is now decidedly hostile to Israel and has taken on the mantle of challenging Israel. And it's gained massive strategic depth in Syria, allowing it to draw very close to the Israeli border while, having Ankara and Istanbul quite far away and far from the front lines. So Hamas achieved something with this operation. It's not that they achieved nothing, but the price that they paid was the total destruction of Gaza. And for them, with their ideology, this is completely acceptable. They don't. They view their own lives, as well as the lives of the Palestinians in general, as extremely expendable.
Well, there's a lot there to go into, Firas. I think that what I'd like to do is I'd like to come back to Turkey. I'd like to come back to Jordan and the situation there. I'd like to come back to Egypt and the situation there, because people often forget that since the Second World War, Egypt has been probably the most powerful military, economic power within the region. And I'd like to especially come back to the Iranian situation as well. But first, I would just like to challenge you with something that is more like the mainstream narrative, to challenge your perspective with what a steel man version of what I think the mainstream narrative would be, the sort of thing that, I don't know, Ben Shapiro or Piers Morgan would say with regard to the Israeli response to the October 7th attacks. He would argue that, look, or they would argue that, look, first of all, Israel has, although with a very regrettable effect on the civilian environment within Gaza, Israel has essentially defeated Hamas as a fighting force, and it secured stunning successes against both Hezbollah and the main sponsor of Hezbollah and Hamas in Iran. It had the decapitation attacks on Iran, which had some great success, killing off, the heads of military and intelligence and some of political leadership. It had various decapitation attacks on Hezbollah, killing off the hugely charismatic and competent Nasrallah and some of his deputies there as well.
The entire military command, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And also some people lower down the tree with the now infamous pager attacks. And it left Hezbollah, which has been for the last 10 or 15 years perhaps the most formidable infantry force within the Middle East, actually, in terms of its actual results. It's left them listless and leaderless and therefore far less effective. It's given the Iranians a terrible bloody nose. And therefore, this has been something of a stunning success. It's also now prevented, by changing the regime within Syria, it's also cut off Syria as a land route to supply Hezbollah from Iran.
All of these things are true.
Yeah.
All of these things. So let's go through them. That Hezbollah was crushed. Yes, huge numbers of mid-level commanders, as well as top commanders, as well as the head of Hezbollah and his designated successor were all killed. And this was a massive success. And Hezbollah was cut off from Iran by land, although it is finding ways to resupply now. And this was a success. The Iraqis were forced to calm down and to sort of stay out of the fight under the threat of much bigger attacks on Iraq. And the decapitation strike against the Iranian rocket leadership, military branches, intelligence, etc., this was successful. And there was a similar strike on Yemen, which was partly successful, and Hamas's top leadership are gone. This is all true. This is all true. But the Palestinians didn't end up going anywhere, meaning that Hamas is still the only game in town in Gaza, and there is no real plan to disarm Hamas. And if there is going to be one, it would mean the introduction of international forces, which will have to be at least partly Muslim, and it will become a template for something similar happening in the West Bank and perhaps even in Jerusalem, and this would be disastrous for Israel. Second, the dynamics in the Middle East were as follows. The Sunnis were somehow pacified and kept out of the fight through the action of the Jordanian monarchy, the Egyptian leadership, and others, which is why Hamas ended up relying on the Shia, Iran, for its backing. Now the tables have turned, and the far more powerful Sunnis, who are 85% of the Muslim population globally, are much more mobilized and much more adamant in their opposition to Israel, to the extent that Saudi normalization seems quite unthinkable. Because the Saudis have been saying since the 70s, confirmed in the 80s and then again in the Beirut summit in 2002, that look, we want a normalization with Israel based on the two-state solution. The Israelis will never accept a two-state solution, meaning that the Saudis have a way out of normalization. And with that, and the invigoration of Sunni opposition to Israel, and with Turkey taking a leading role in that opposition, the Israelis are now actually worse off because they have to fight a considerably larger force. So for the Iranians, they had to extend themselves through Iraq, through the Sunni parts of Syria, which is mostly Sunni, through Lebanon, where you have a big number of Palestinians and Syrians, as well as the Shia of Hezbollah, in order to reach Israel and threaten Israel. For Turkey, it's a non-issue. They have the Kurds as allies in parts of northern Iraq. They have a problem with the Kurds in Syria, but this is a problem only because the Americans are still there. They have the rest of Syria from which they can threaten Israel. The Israelis are conducting strikes within Syria to prevent that, to sort of find some way of demarking spheres of influence between them and the Turks. And Trump is saying to the Israelis, well, you need to reconcile with Turkey, and you need to find some kind of accommodation with my very good friend Erdogan, who's clearly the new man in charge. And if you listen to the American envoy to Turkey, but also to Syria and to Lebanon, Tom Barak, who's originally Lebanese, he's saying publicly that, look, guys, if this Hezbollah problem persists, Lebanon is going to be taken over effectively by the Syrians, and they will police it. But they will police it means that they will solve the Hezbollah problem for Israel, yes, but while creating a much, much bigger problem with a much bigger population. So it's a bit of a Pyrrhic victory because it isn't against the strongest enemy of Israel. The Shia were able to play this role as the main enemy of Israel because of the ideology of Khomeini and the Islamic Revolution, but also because the Sunnis were not really involved in the fight. Now, this has changed, and the Sunnis have been galvanized. Plus, one of the main effects of this war has been the delegitimization of Israel in the West and the rise of voices like Nick Fuentes, who will argue that, look, what the mainstream Republicans are saying, that we need to stop intervening in the Middle East, well, some of the mainstream at least, people like Vance and Trump, obviously not people like Lindsey Graham and Ted Cruz, is never going to work while we have this much Israeli influence and while we are this close to Israel. So a total break with Israel, and indeed with, quote unquote, the Jews, is necessary. And this is gaining traction, and this is gaining huge popularity. So the Israelis have ended up in a situation where the American left is deeply hostile to them because they are white settler colonialists, evil, blah, 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 the whole litany of grievances that the left has. And the right has a growing grievance with them because the argument is that because of the support of Israel, the United States keeps getting dragged into unnecessary wars in the Middle East, and these wars become incredibly destabilizing and incredibly expensive for the American treasury. So when you look at all of that, killing Nasrallah, killing a few Iranian generals, impressive as it is, it doesn't begin to cover the other side of the ledger, which is the loss of support from the West in general. The Israelis are ridiculously unpopular right now, and the fact that the Sunnis have been galvanized and they've been convinced that, look, guys, there's no pathway towards peace with the Israelis because they insist on taking everything. And so you've ended up in this dynamic where the Israelis themselves are becoming more radical. If you look at the rise of Ben Gvir and Smotrich, obviously the Israeli political landscape is incredibly unstable, and we have no idea who will succeed them. But since 1996 at least, the Israelis have been moving steadily to the right. And now Hamas has succeeded in moving the Muslim world in general behind it, while getting Israel to become unpopular in the West. So I don't see, I don't deny the great successes that the Israelis have had in killing a lot of their enemies. It's just that they've also created a whole batch of new ones.
Yeah, I mean, the journalist and columnist and author Peter Hitchens often says that the front lines of Israel's battle for national survival are not in Jerusalem or the West Bank or in Gaza. They're actually in the suburbs of American swing states like Florida and
absolutely.
Michigan. And the fact that obvious kind of stereotypical American shock jock hucksters like Nick Fuentes are managing to get some traction on this is pretty bad news for the Israelis, given that the American left, the American Democrat left, is shifting toward, or the American Democratic left is shifting towards something more like the European left position on the Israel question. Whereas in the past, in the past actually, in America at least, and I think to a certain degree in Europe as well, the Israeli cause was something of a left-wing cause. But people forget in the 1960s it was very popular in the left to go work in a kibbutz and this sort of thing. So that the left has long since been transitioning toward a European position. And just as the European right, from my point of view, quite bafflingly, because while I view it as a human tragedy and therefore pretty nasty to watch, I have no idea whatsoever why British people get so hot under the collar about this. I understand why maybe the Pakistani or the Bangladeshi community would, because it's about their brother Muslims and the rest, but I'm not sure why the rest of us do. But the fact that in America now you're starting to see a large and actually pretty popular faction of the right, even if it doesn't have a large and powerful faction within the Congressional Republican Party as yet, they're still very much a minority. I think it's at least 50% of the American Republican base is also shifting away from the US position on Israel should be concerning. But I just want to ask you about the Sunni position on Israel. And you said that the Sunnis have been galvanized to a certain degree under perhaps Turkish leadership or potentially Turkish leadership in the future. I kind of question that, because after Kissinger's 1970s shuttle diplomacy at the end of the Yom Kippur War, and then ultimately reaching fruition, I guess you might say, under the Cyrus Vance and Jimmy Carter and the Camp David Accords. Basically, the US traded billions of dollars worth of aid toward Egypt at first, but eventually the Jordanians as well. So they shoveled trainload, big pallets of $100 bills into Egypt and Jordan. And in exchange, the Egyptians and Jordanians played nicey nice with the Israelis. In fact, the Egyptians normalized and recognized relations with and recognized the state of Israel. And since then, the Jordanians have been very quiescent when it comes to the Israeli question. And as you said, in fact, they were even taking part in knocking out Iranian missiles heading toward Israel in the last year or so. How, that kind of aid buys a lot of action within countries as poor as Jordan and as on the brink of constantly on the precipice of economic collapse as Egypt, which it is. We shouldn't forget just how indebted as a country it is. It has this growing population and nowhere for them to go. It's creating nowhere near enough jobs for them. But it is still militarily, traditionally it had been the military leader in the region. Certainly up to 1973, and to a certain degree, I think it still is the most powerful Arab military force. So, after the Arab Spring, the Muslim Brotherhood was voted in, and the US was able to kick them out extremely quickly. They didn't last long at all. I would assume the same thing would happen if they tried again. The same thing would happen in Jordan. Like, how are the Turks, how is Ankara going to replace the Americans geopolitically with the Egyptians and Jordanians, as you suggest?
First there's a question of time frame. Let me sort of break this up into pieces. The first thing to remember is how unpopular peace with Israel is. You get zero credibility if you say, actually, we shouldn't be fighting Israel. We have bigger problems. Nobody gets any credibility by saying that. The extent of hatred of Israel and of Jews is very deeply ingrained. And the kinds of scenes that we saw from Gaza, regardless of the debate on whether or not they're justified, reinforce that position very much. And the narrative is that if we'd all fought alongside the Palestinians, none of this would be happening. So that's important to remember. The second point is these are very brittle and fragile regimes. What happened in Egypt was that the military overthrew Mubarak, made a deal with the Muslim Brotherhood. Mohammed Morsi, the president of Egypt from the Muslim Brotherhood at the time, who governed for a year and a half or something like that, never actually governed but was in power officially, was stupid enough to call for jihad in Syria with the aim of exactly this, of opening up strategic depth for Turkey so that Sunni powers in the region could be united. And the army made the decision, okay, this is too much, we have to overthrow him. But in doing so, the army enormously exposed itself. In doing so, the army basically became the lightning rod, and it has consistently failed to deliver. They live in absolute luxury. The Egyptians live in ridiculous poverty. And they don't have any intention of delivering because their view is that it was the Egyptian middle class that caused the instability in the late 2000s, which culminated in the overthrow of Mubarak, and we never want to have this again. We'd rather have a two-class society than a three-class society. And that's what they're working towards. But the consequence of that is an immense supply of extremely expendable young men. And at some point, these guys aren't going to remain in power forever. And when that happens, what will they look to govern them? They will say this is a secular-ish state that is godless and doesn't care about Islam. We need to go back to authentic religion and fight. And do what the Turks have been doing, which is to re-indoctrinate society in Islam, to re-Islamize society, and by doing that we can fight. And if you look at the level of religious conservatism in Egypt, for somebody who knows Egypt from the 50s, for example, if you were to sort of put them in Cairo University today, they'd be shocked. Because all of the girls wear hijab, a lot more girls wear the niqab, and everybody is outwardly, at least, a lot more religiously observant. And this energy is going to go somewhere. And as you correctly point out, both Egypt and Jordan are constantly on the financial brink. Jordan gets something like 2 or 3% of its GDP in foreign aid. Well, imagine what happens if Europe and America turn a bit isolationist and decide we don't want to fund the Jordanians, we don't care about the Middle East. How's that going to play out? And then when you look at European economies and you see their level of indebtedness, the size of their deficits, etc., you realize that at some point this break is going to happen because the whole Western financial system, the whole Western economic system is fundamentally broken. And there's going to be a populist who comes in one day and says, I don't want to give aid to anybody, and actually means it. It's a matter of time. When that happens, who will these young Muslim men look to for leadership? Is it going to be somebody advocating for a balanced approach that says, let's find a compromise with the Jewish people, let's forgive past grievances, let's find a way to all get along? Or is it going to be somebody who says jihad? And then when you think about the fact that the Turks have pretty advanced military industries, huge amounts of European supply chains go through Turkey, the Turks manufacture everything, including jets, including drones. They were one of the leaders in the drone game. You then see that, okay, you have this excess manpower, you have this decent industrial capability, which the Egyptians are also building, you have this massive grievance, and you have this oversupply of young men. What is the result going to be? Well, the answer is war. The answer obviously is war. So, again, I'm not looking at it from the perspective of this battle and how much the Israelis advance here and how much the Israelis advance there. I mean, think about it this way. After these 2 years of fighting, the Israelis haven't actually conquered all of Gaza. They haven't taken it all because they haven't had the manpower to take all of Gaza, because they don't have any acceptance of casualties. Their casualty tolerance is extremely low. Extremely low. What does the Muslim casualty tolerance look like? They don't care. That's the one thing that they have an incredible surplus of. And the Israelis are fighting this against enemies in Gaza that aren't really using drones in the way that the Ukrainians are doing, or the way that the Russians are doing, and still this advance is staggeringly slow. What happens if the Turks teach the Egyptians how to build a decent drone game and to use drones properly? What happens if the Turks use their own capabilities and start manufacturing drones en masse? I mean, the perennial problem for Turkey has always been that their current account deficit is too big because they have to import a lot of energy. Well, now they're trying to extract more energy from the Black Sea. They're working on extracting more from the Mediterranean. And they're working on basically consolidating over northern Iraq and Syria. Northern Iraq, obviously, massively energy-rich territory. Kirkuk is not producing anywhere near its full capacity when proper drilling is done. And then you think about this a generation down the line. That excess manpower problem is still going to be there. By then, odds are the Turks would have solved their energy problem. And that means that their manufacturing capability is going to be even greater. I mean, Turkey is one of those few countries that is almost self-sufficient in food and is working towards self-sufficiency in energy. They end up there with this strategic depth and with this massive geopolitical importance because of their location, They're a big player. Who are they going to set their eyes against? Well, obviously, it's going to be the Israelis, because that's the main competitor whose defeat is actually feasible. When you think about Israel, when I think about Israel, I remember that it has maybe 9 or 12 power stations, 4 or 5 ports, 3 civilian airports, a dozen or so military airports. It's an incredibly tiny country. And the way to think about Israel is, imagine if Crimea was dominating all of Russia and Ukraine and the Black Sea. Or imagine if Sicily was the most dominant power in Europe. It makes no sense geopolitically, because this small geography can't sustain that much power indefinitely unless it has incredible technology, which it currently does have. But that's why the Muslim world is turning towards China. That's why they look to China for alliances. That's why Turkey and Pakistan cooperate on all kinds of military technology, and Pakistan and China cooperate on all kinds of military technology. So the bloc that is being built against the West is really dangerous and is really huge. And one of the first targets for the Muslims is obviously going to be Israel. It's their source of endless humiliation and embarrassment. And this war in Gaza demonstrated that. So, we were arguably reaching a point where the Saudis were going to sign the Abraham Accords. I never thought that it was likely, and even if it does happen, I think it'll be about as warm as the Egyptian peace. There's going to be a lot of noise and media celebrating it if it happens, but it would mean that the Israelis have to recognize a pathway towards a Palestinian state. I don't see how that happens. I don't see which Israeli leader can build a coalition to govern Israel on the basis that, one of the lessons of 7 October is that we need to give them the West Bank. That's the lesson we took from 7 October. That's just not going to happen. And so this radicalization keeps on getting enforced.
Yeah, I mean, certainly Turkey is it's geopolitically one of the natural hegemons of that region. It's, you rightly say, because of its location, controlling the exit to the Black Sea, which for 1,000 years or more has been a key trading basin for furs and timber and silks, to the modern day for steel and oil. But it also, because of its location, has avenues to gain geopolitical influence in a range of theaters in the world. It can push eastward through the Caucasus and Azerbaijan, across the Caspian Sea, into the Turkic-speaking Muslim nations of Central Asia, places like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, the vast energy riches of those countries. And we have seen it having startling success with that sort of thrust over the last 5 years. It could equally push northeastward through the Caucasus into the Volga River basin, towards Turkish-speaking regions in Russia like Tatarstan and Bashkortostan, right in the center of Russia. It could push south, which it has done, through Syria and into Iraq and toward the Arabian Peninsula. It could push southwest through Cyprus and into the Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa. Or it could push, as it has done in the past on more than one occasion, it could push northwest into Balkan Europe, into Albania and Muslim Bosnia, for example. It wouldn't surprise me over the next 10 years to hear of Turkey taking a really major role in places like Kosovo and opportunistically.
They were integral to the Bosnian campaign against the Serbs. Turkey played a big part in that, in partnership with Iran and Hezbollah, by the way, and Saudi Arabia and Al-Qaeda and all of these lovely actors. So they've done that. Putin tries his best to stay on Erdogan's good side because he understands that he has massive vulnerability in the Caucasus. That's why, partly because of Armenia's own actions, but that's another contributing reason as to why he doesn't back the Armenians more effectively. He knows that they might have to share influence in Central Asia and that they have enormous amounts of shared interest in Central Asia. And so they work together to keep that region in an acceptable state to both of them. And Russian businessmen are very much partnered with Turkish businessmen as a way of getting around all of these European and American sanctions. I mean, Turkey's sanctions enforcement is pretty much non-existent.
Sorry to interrupt, but not only that, Firas, but you mentioned Turkey's efforts to gain some kind of energy independence as a route to dealing with their long-standing and their chronic and large current account deficit. But I believe I'm right in saying that the Russian Federation is one of the major players in the construction of nuclear power stations in the world, and the Russian state-owned company that does that is building nuclear power stations in Turkey, right?
Yes, yes. The strategy of Putin is not to make an enemy out of Turkey, no matter what. So even after the Turks shot down a Russian jet in 2015 in Syria, there was a very angry reaction from the Russians, and they sort of shook their fists in anger and did all of that. But thankfully for the Russians, Obama decided to ditch Turkey and not to support them, and not to in any way back them against Russia. And the result was the Astana process. The Russians, the Iranians, and the Turks working together to manage Syria. And they succeeded in doing that for 10 years. And even after the collapse of the Assad government in Syria, the Russians and Turks are still cooperating, and you can tell because the Russian bases are still there. They're immensely vulnerable to the drone warfare that the Turks had taught the Syrian jihadis how to conduct, but the jihadis haven't dared touch the Russian bases because they're under orders from Turkey. So this collaboration is based on the fact that they have this shared spheres of influence, and they compete within them, and they manage their competition. So you see them in Libya fighting each other one day and then managing their relationship the other day. Or you see them fighting each other in Libya, cooperating in Syria, and making money together in Central Asia, while Azerbaijan and Armenia are on fire. So this kind of very compartmentalized relationship between the two sides is very conscious and very deliberate, and it's very important for both Erdogan and Putin because they don't want to fight each other. They view the West as their enemy. And the more and the suicidal part is the way in which Western policy, especially since the 1990s, has been pushing Turkey, Iran, Russia, and China all closer together. That's the genuinely suicidal part. That's the genuinely insane part.
Well, right. I mean, let's move on to that because I don't think I'm putting words into your mouth, Firas, when I say that. I mean, I said before that Turkey is one of the natural hegemons of the Middle East and perhaps even North Africa in addition to that. But I think it's fair to say that one of your main theses, or it might be quite a general one rather than specific, is that Turkey indeed will once again become a hegemon, certainly of the Arabian Peninsula, and probably something more like the broader Muslim world in that part of the world, from North Africa to the Hindu Kush. Okay, so perhaps you could give an overview of how you envisage that happening. What is the process by which that would happen? What are the specific mechanics, so to speak?
So let's talk about this. Erdogan's first national security advisor was a man by the name of Ahmed Davutoglu. And his PhD thesis became a book called Strategic Depth. The main thrust of this book is that the Turkish sphere of influence is going to extend from the Sahel in Africa, through North Africa, through the Middle East and Arabia, all the way into Turkic Central Asia, through the Caucasus up to Grozny, and all the way to Albania and Kosovo and the Muslim parts of Southeastern Europe. On the back of this, he became National Security Advisor, on the back of this ideology. The There they had all kinds of fights, etc., etc. But that ideology became part of how Erdogan decided to proceed. Initially, it was supposed to be done in peaceful ways up until 2011 kicked off. And the way that this would be done was through the expansion of schools, through the building of commercial relationships, through the expansion of Turkish businesses, etc., etc. And so you see Erdogan constantly announcing new destinations for Turkish Airways, and then he gets on a plane and he takes a couple of hundred businessmen and he takes them wherever he's going, and he tries to help them secure opportunities, mainly in Muslim countries, with the idea being, we are your alternative to Europe. We can provide you with European goods at a cheaper price for a better deal. And you've seen this constantly. 2010 convinced Turkey that there has to be a military component to it. And this is when the currency began crashing, which I've long argued is at least partly deliberate, because Erdogan understands interest rates and inflation as well as I do. And so if he's allowed this to happen, it means that his aim was to reduce the cost of Turkish labor, get Turkey to escape the middle income trap by allowing it to continue to grow its industry by providing cheap labor, which is exactly what he ended up doing, which was actually an argument that I think President Özal in Turkey had used in the 1990s. So you see this steady policy of trying to connect Turkey to the rest of the Muslim world and link the Muslim world culturally to Turkey and send the elites of Muslim countries to study in Turkey so that they'd have a favorable view of it. And you see this increasingly Islamic rhetoric from Erdogan to say that I'm the natural leader of the Muslim world. And then you look at the competition. Like, who is going to lead the Muslim world? Saudi Arabia? Egypt? The Muslim mind needs leadership. The reason for the chaos in the Middle East is the absence of Muslim leadership. Who is in a position to provide it? The only people who can qualify in any way are the Turks, because they have the right geography, because they have the right influence, because they have the right industrial capabilities, because they have the right location, etc. So I've very much been arguing that Turkey is going to play that leadership role again. And when you look at the chaos around Turkey, I mean, how are the Sunnis of Iraq doing? Would they be doing better under more Turkish influence or less? Probably better under more Turkish influence. How are the Sunnis of Syria doing? Would they be better off with more Turkish influence or less? Jordan, Egypt, you can continue. I mean, Egypt can be a regional power its own right, but not really a competitor to Turkey. And under this leadership is a bit of a joke. So the only people who are in a position to play this leadership role are the Turks. And they're doing that by a combination of military cooperation. They sign military deals with everybody and try to supply them with drones and with training and with equipment. And they're not just offering drones, they're offering air defense now, they're offering jets, they're offering helicopters, they're offering all kinds of things. And they're offering intelligence cooperation and military support. And you see this game being played. So yeah, I think Turkey is going to become an even more influential country. And the way that they describe it is very important. The way that they describe their role is that no problem can be solved anywhere around us without us. What does that mean? It means that if you try to exclude us, we will make your life hell. How? Using the jihadis, who they've worked with hand in glove, and we saw that in Syria, where essentially Islamic State has an ambassador to Turkey, and Turkish MIT was doing, the intelligence agency of Turkey was doing a huge amount to help Islamic State, including supplying them with weapons, treating their wounded, giving them these networks through which they can smuggle people, etc., etc., until their relationship eventually soured. So the Turks have what it takes. They have the right kind of cynicism. And the current foreign minister of Turkey, who's being groomed to succeed Erdogan, Hakkar Fidan, he was the former head of intelligence. So this ideology of Turkey having this massive sphere of influence extending from Central Asia to the Sahel, through Albania, through Arabia, through the Caucasus, It was this guy who's in charge of actually implementing it, Haqqan Fidan. And he's been promoted from spook to foreign minister. What does it say when you have somebody like that as foreign minister? It says that you're not only giving him the security portfolio, the sort of dirty tricks of espionage and all of that, you're also giving him the economic portfolio and the management of trade relations with countries that are being targeted in order to achieve this objective of greater Turkish influence. So it's not just that they have this strategy, it's that they're actively pursuing it. And you see it in a place like Libya, where they, in the teeth of Russian opposition, kept their people in charge in Western Libya and signed a deal that pretty much excluded Greece and Cyprus from their own maritime claims and expanded the claims of Turkey and of Egypt and Libya at their expense. So what are they saying here? They're saying to the Egyptians, you have a big problem with energy. One of the solutions is offshore drilling. You don't have enough territory to drill offshore. We're going to give you more of it. How about that? And we will help you with the technology, and we'll bring some Malaysian companies to assist you, and so on and so forth. So this isn't just a theory. It's being actively pursued. It has been actively pursued for almost a generation now. I think Erdogan took power in 2001 or 2002. So we're getting close to the 30 years of this being done. And his successor, who's being groomed to come after him, is going to do the exact same thing. And this is baked into the institutional thinking of the Turkish military defense and of the Turkish military and the Department of Defense and the Navy and all of these actors who believe in expanding Turkish power and in making Turkey a global power for the Muslim world. And Iran is now somewhat out of the picture. I mean, the Israelis are saying that Iran is considering restarting the war with them. I understand the logic. They want to sort of erase the humiliation, restore balance, and save the regime. I don't think it's very realistic. I don't think that's what the Iranians are going to do, but that's what the Israelis are saying. We will see.
I agree with you on Turkey. I mean, even on a more fundamental level, they don't have to put give the Egyptians offshore drilling necessarily, or help the Jordanians or whatever. I mean, on a fundamental level, Turkey's position in the world is just so important. I mean, if you're Russia and you want to transport oil or grain or steel, all of which you produce in vast quantities, I think it's underestimated just how important the Russian Federation is for these things. And if you want to transport that from your ports on the Western Caucasus to Suez or into the Mediterranean and thence into the Atlantic and get it to market that way, you need to deal with the Turks. If you're Europe and you want to get gas and oil from Central Asia because you're no longer willing to deal with the Russians, well, you have to deal with Turkey. If you're the Americans and you want to kind of deal with the Sunni militias in the Middle East, then you have to deal with Turkey. If you're a Caucasus country and you want to deal with issues that you have with Azerbaijan, for example, and you have to deal with the Turks, like all of these things, Turkey is essential. If you want to deal with disputes in the Eastern Mediterranean, then you have to deal with Turkey. And Turkey, simply by its existence on that bit of land, it, has tremendous geopolitical power, awesome geopolitical power. In fact, that positioning also makes it kind of vulnerable because people always need to meddle with it. It's too important just to leave alone to become tremendously powerful on its own. So, eventually as it gains power, it will alarm people in a way that Gabon becoming really powerful in Africa wouldn't alarm people. But at the same time, it does have that power. But look, getting on to the Iranian situation, you started talking about that. So let me frame that, if I may, and we can kind of finish on this, because my version is that Iran just about withstood the shock of Israel's first punch, and it was a dazzling opening attack from Israel. It really was quite impressive. But crucially, Iran managed to weather that. And slowly it was starting to attrit the Israelis with its missile launchers. Now, I don't know who would have won that battle of attrition, but I do know that any kind of war of attrition, whether it be, tanks and artillery slugging it out on static front lines, or whether it be exchanges of air attacks, is not good for a nation like Israel. But I think one thing that 12-day war really highlighted was this: the Iranians must now know that they need a bomb. They need to proliferate. Whatever their position on proliferation was before the 12-day war, in Tehran, and unless they have a genuine ideological and really heartfelt ideological position against it because of whatever reason, I don't know, it's Shia Islam, or they're all secret CND sandal-wearing hippies. I don't know what the reason might be, but unless they have something so ideologically powerful that it overrides national survival, then they must understand now that they need to have a bomb. Now, if they're going to be able to develop a bomb, then they need to have credible air defense. That means land-based A2AD platforms that can provide some kind of bubble. It also means a credible modern air force supported with modern fighter jets, modern fighter maintenance facilities, and airborne AWACS systems that can all integrate together and defend Iran's airspace. And in order to do that, who do they turn to? Well, they're going to have to ignore this kind of this policy that they've tried to follow in the last 25, 30 years, 30 years since the end of the Iran-Iraq war, of being a regional superpower that can go it alone and is free of foreign influence. They're going to have to get rid of that, and they're going to have to turn to the Russians, but mainly they're going to have to turn to the Chinese, and they're going to have to do what the Pakistanis did, and basically go to the Chinese and say, we want a turnkey system that gives us, at the very least, 4 high-quality fourth-generation fighters and AWACS systems that can all integrate together. We want the training, we want the jets, we want the AWACS, we want the integration. And maybe from the Russians, once the Ukraine war is finished, you can go and get some proper, serious S-400, maybe S-500, that they can also integrate together. And by doing that, Iran is actually going to be a pretty powerful nation. It's going to link up with the Pakistanis. It's going to link up with the Chinese. It's going to link up with the Russians. There's this north-south trading corridor, which will go from St. Petersburg through Moscow into the Russian Caspian Basin, through Iran, into the Persian Gulf and Indian Ocean, and to Mumbai. And it will massively cut the transit from the Russian Federation to India. By doing this, the Iranians can also gain influence. They can also gain power. And although their land link through Iran and Syria to Hezbollah has been blocked, and Hezbollah has probably, at least temporarily, lost some of its potency because of the decapitation strikes, because Gaza has been leveled, and although Hamas clearly still exists, it hasn't been finally defeated and destroyed. That has been neutered temporarily, at least. The Iranians have found some pretty serious compensation for that in the form of the Houthis in Yemen, who have proven, geopolitically at least, far more powerful than Hezbollah or Hamas ever were, because they've managed to close the Red Sea and thus the Suez Canal, through which 12% of global maritime trade hitherto travelled. So maybe it's not just the Turks. The Iranians are now on a path to becoming a far more powerful national force.
So the one thing that would solve Israel's problems for another decade or two would be a big fight between the Turks and the Iranians. Now, the problem that the Iranians have is this. They, under Khomeini, moved away from Shia nationalism to pan-Islamism. You have to remember that Khomeini translated the works of Sayyid Qutb personally. And Sayyid Qutb was the main ideologue behind the even greater militarization and militancy of the Muslim Brotherhood. And people underestimate how militant and how subversive the Muslim Brotherhood is. But that's a conversation to another time. Anyhow, they tried to move from Shia nationalism in a way to pan-Islamism. This proved to be a failure. This proved to be a failure completely, because they decided to take on Israel by going and expanding in a sea of Sunnis in order to get to the Jewish state. And this didn't work. Now they need to return to Shia nationalism, and they have southern Iraq at the very least up to Baghdad. You have to remember that the ancient Persian capital was on the Euphrates, basically. It wasn't deep in the mountains of Persia and Tehran as it is today. And now they're trying to solve that problem. When it comes to rearmament, there is a big panic in Israel and in the West because the Iranians are going to the Chinese and saying, what can you give us? What do we need? Previously, the big problem why the Iranians had such a fragmented air defense was because in 2008 they decided that their priority was to make the country resilient to strikes. And the way to make it resilient to strikes was to distribute commands, to distribute command, basically, so that the IRGC could survive any decapitation strike, like the ones they just received, and continue to fight regardless. This was the main objective of the restructuring of the Iranian military and the IRGC in 2008. The other problem that they have is the competition between the IRGC and the military. Who controls air defense? And who should have this kind of strategic asset? And they haven't been able to solve this problem. Now, the way that this goes in the Muslim world is this. After the religious state, you get military rule, which is what happened in Egypt under the Mamluks, who were the military slave elite, which is what happened to the Abbasids when first the Persians and then the Turks took influence over the military command, which is a very old story in the Muslim world, that transition from religious rule to military rule. And this requires a redefining of Iranian ideology away from pan-Islamism and back to Shia nationalism. It cannot happen while Khamenei is alive, but somebody like Masoud Pezeshkian, the current president of Iran, who would have a pretty prominent position if Khamenei dies and there isn't a clearly designated successor, would want to make that transition, as would some elements of the IRGC. You have to remember that the IRGC's view of the Arabs is incredibly dim. So there's a video from the Syrian civil war in around 2013, 2014. A group of Iranian officers are traveling and they have a media guy. And the media guy says, who lives here? Arabs? And they go, yes, dogs live here, basically. So there's this deep racism from the Persians towards the Arabs, which makes this kind of transition possible. And the partnership with China makes this transition possible. But Iran can only be a Shia nationalist state. It cannot be a pan-Islamic state. And the Shia are 15% of the population. So they'll have influence in Lebanon, big influence in Iraq. They'll have some influence in Yemen, because the Yemeni Houthi are the wrong kind of Shia, basically. They are 5er Shia as opposed to 12er Shia. And that's another conversation for another time. But they can't be the kind of hegemon that Turkey can be. They can't extend into West Africa in the same way. They can't extend into Russia in the same way. They can't extend into Central Asia in the same way. They are limited by their own Shiism and by the fact that their pan-Islamism failed, because they are still hated for being Shia. So there is a limit on the extent of Iranian power. But everything else that you said, Iran playing a key role in the connection between Russia and India as part of the international north-south transit corridor through the port of Chabahar. Yes, that's very important, and that's going to play a big role. And it's important for the Russians, and it's important for the Indians. And I think we just saw the Indians and the Russians signing some kind of agreement today. I haven't looked at the details of it. So yes, you're absolutely right. Turning to China, yes, absolutely correctly. Having a better relationship with Pakistan, slightly difficult. They are still going to compete with the Baloch issue on their shared border and over the Afghan issue. So that's not going to go very swimmingly. Being closer to Turkey, that's a bit of a problem. Being closer to the Arabs, to the Gulf Arabs, that's relatively easy because the Gulf monarchies are terrified of Turkish influence. They don't want to fall under Turkish influence. They'd rather have a strong Iran deterring Turkey and keeping Turkey far away than have a weak Iran and therefore an open door towards them from Turkey. So there are nuances and specifics there, which in total mean that the Iranians can have only a decent relationship with the Gulf Sunni Arabs, but not with the Pakistanis, not with the Turks. And definitely they can have an excellent relationship with the Chinese, and they can have an excellent relationship with the Russians and with the Indians. So it'll be a very important player, but it's very constrained by the difference in religion. Because Shia Islam, the mindset is quite different from Sunni Islam, and the extent to which they hate each other is just beyond your imagination. It's incredible how much Shia and Sunni hate each other. They're still litigating the succession to Muhammad and how it played out and the grievances of the Shia.
Well, for us, I, for one, always like to wrap things up on a note of hatred and sectarian enmity. So I suppose all that's left is for me to ask you to direct people to where they can find more of your work, where they can find more of your thinking, because of the people that are talk about geopolitics, you've always been one of the most interesting and I think recently one of the more prescient commentators as well. So where can people find more of your work? Where should they visit? What should they do?
Oh, thank you very much. And again, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. My website is modadgeopolitics.com. I publish on that regularly, and I work with clients in insurance, corporate security, strategy, all kinds of other areas, helping them, navigate doing business in the Middle East. I tweet not as politely as I do on my website, and I post my tweets on Modad GOP on X. You can just find me on Firas Modad. And I just want to thank you again for inviting me to speak to you. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. It's always a pleasure to hear your own insights. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, the pleasure is all mine, Firas. Again, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.